Want to tell you about one of our sponsors, Accountable to You.
Jesus is Lord. In public and in private, every area of our life must be subject to his lordship,
including our use of technology. What captures our attention on the screen either glorifies or dishonors the Lord. That's why Accountable to You is committed to promoting biblical accountability in families and churches.
Their monitoring and reporting software makes transparency easy on all your devices, so you can say with the psalmist, I would not set anything worthless before my eyes.
Guard against temptation with Accountable to You and live for God's glory. You can try it free today at accountable2you.com/cultureproof. That's accountable, the number 2, YOU.com/cultureproof. We've already signed up, protecting our family, and we invite you to do the same. Visit them, accountable2you.com/cultureproof. Thanks for checking out Culture Proof. I'm Miki.
And I'm Will.
And today the question is, can there be justice for the littlest lamb? We are going to have a conversation with a former prosecutor who's going to help us make sense of what's happened with the littlest lamb. And I want to be careful because I know that even in having this conversation, there's a child involved. And so we want to protect her as much as we can. But I do think that there are a lot of conversations that are happening that there could be the benefit of having a professional, having someone who actually has worked on cases like this, talk about just in general some of the details of these CSA cases.
Yeah, that's the most important thing that we want to talk about in this episode, because you see a lot of things out there and that could get lost in all of the different drama issues in this situation. But man, there's a little girl, and we need to talk about her and see what should happen in this situation.
So we're going to get to that in just a little bit. Before we do, I want to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, BJU Press Homeschool. They make it possible for us to homeschool our kids with confidence. We trust them to come alongside us as we disciple, as we defend the truth of God's word in our home. We encourage you to check them out today. You can go to bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. That will be your way of letting them know if you, I should say /culture-proof. bjupresshomeschool.com/culture-proof. That'll be your way of letting them know that the Addisons sent you. All right. Yes. Will the Great. Let's just jump right in. Our guest today, and some people guessed this because we actually alluded to it on yesterday's podcast drop, and some people were like, is it going to be Mr. Abe? Is it going to? Yes, it's Mr. Abraham Hamilton III. Because we got into a conversation on Sunday at our local fellowship. And I just had a question for Abe. I just said, is there the possibility of justice or justice for this little girl,
right,
and all the conversation that we're having? And Abe immediately put on his prosecutorial hat. I mean, seriously, and started walking through cases that he had prosecuted and walking through some of the details and walking through what needed to happen. And I was like, you have to tell our audience this information. Like, people need to know this. And so he agreed to join us. Let me just give kind of a little bit of a background here. Abe serves as legal counsel for American Family Association. He also is the host of his national radio program, The Hamilton Corner. He is also a pastor and a teacher and a national speaker. He also is a husband of one wife and a father, a homeschooling dad to 6 children. He formerly served as a prosecutor in both Louisiana and Texas, and he's joining us today to wear several hats, right? The conversation is going to take several turns because you can't talk about CSA, especially if you're a parent, and not think about your own children or think about the implications of predators walking among us. Abe, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me to join you.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And I'm so glad that you were able to fit us into your schedule, because we had this conversation just sort of on the fly. The first thing that we did, and I want you to speak to this, was we went to you and we said, hey, we've got a video out. Just fun fact, full disclosure, you actually serve on our board. And so we value not only your opinion about what we're doing, but your legal expertise.
Yes.
And so we said, hey, we've got a video out and we want to make sure that we're staying within the legal guidelines, that we would not be guilty of slandering anyone, that we would not be guilty of defamation. And so would you check out that video and let us know your thoughts? Which led to the question, why are we still referring in these very public allegations? Why are we referring to this alleged offender as Pete? And so you brought some insight to that, but then it kind of went into us talking about whether or not there could be justice for this child. So before we get into the specifics as it pertains to the Daystar situation, tell us a little bit about your professional background as a prosecutor.
Yeah, I served as a major felony prosecutor for about a decade, actually, before I took the general counsel position at American Association. The previous week, I just finished, I just completed the last homicide trial that I was participating in, a week-long trial as a major felony prosecutor. And so when I say major felonies, I'm talking about the stuff that people watch on like Law and Order, homicide cases, armed robberies, CSA cases, SA cases, aggravated assault with deadly weapons, those kind of things, felons in possession of firearms. Major felonies are cases that I prosecuted. And just so people can understand, the thing that distinguishes a felony from a misdemeanor is the potential sentencing range upon conviction for the case. Usually across the country and in federally, misdemeanors are those cases to where the sentences cannot exceed a year in confinement. Felonies are generally those that exceed a year in confinement, and major felonies are those things, like I said, they make television shows and movies about. And so these are the cases. This was my life for a decade, so I have personally prosecuted cases from the filing of the charges, from the filing of the charges stage, all the way through the indictment stage, all the way through the trial stage of CSA cases, along with, homicide cases, armed robbery, et cetera, like I just described. So that was my life for about a decade in Harris County, Texas. That's in the Houston, Texas area. Some people know this, some people don't know this. The city of Houston is the largest city within the county of Harris County. Harris County includes not just Houston, Texas, but also the suburbs surrounding Houston, Texas, and also prosecuted in the Louisiana area, in the Jefferson Parish District Attorney's Office, which stumping grounds that you two know quite well. That's why I served in the 24th Judicial District Court is where I prosecuted those felony cases.
I probably should give a disclaimer at this point and just let some of our listeners and our viewers know that some of the content that we talk about may be a little bit disturbing. Like it's not, man, it's graphic to understand what is in the heart of man and what man is capable of carrying out against man. So I do want to issue that as a warning, especially for people. We've been noticing in some of the comments that there are people who have been victims of SA. And so some of this may just be traumatic to hear, because I am going to ask you to talk a little bit about the kinds of cases that come across your desk and specifically, or came across your desk. And specifically, I want to ask about the likelihood that a child who would be a victim of just a complete stranger, one that he or she would be just unacquainted with. And so I want to build to that. But talk a little bit about some of the cases, in particular, the CSA cases, because also there were murder trials, but those CSA cases that came across your desk, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And I say this as a human being first, as a Christian and a father. I've handled, I can't count the number of murder cases I've handled. And when I say handled, I mean, I was the prosecutor in charge of navigating how this case will be prosecuted. Many people may not be aware the overwhelming majority of cases do not go to trial. So I've tried, I don't even know how many homicide cases, but I've handled exponentially more than I've tried, and I've also handled and tried CSA cases. And considering the finality on this side of eternity of homicide cases, some people might think that surely those cases are the ones that stick out in your mind from your history and that's particular career. But honestly, the CSA cases are the ones that stick with me far more, considering the innocence of children and having their innocence encroached upon when that happens in the orbit around that entire phenomenon. I mean, I've been there endeavoring to help families pick up the pieces even after a trial, to see what it looks like on the other side of these cases. And so the many of the CSA cases stick out in my mind and my heart even more than some of the homicide cases, which may be striking for people to hear and learn. And I'm pretty sure that my experience is not unique. You talk to other prosecutors, they'll probably say the same things, or police officers, detectives, they'll probably say the same thing.
Is it solely because you're talking about children and the details that surround that? Is that a driving factor? Would you say that you would have the same feeling if it's a homicide case that involves a child? Is it the child involvement, or is it the nature of SA cases?
Yeah, it's the nature of SA cases. It's child involvement, yes, but the nature of SA cases carry a particular resonance over time. It's the nature of the case in addition to child involvement.
Okay, so what can you share with us about some of the cases that came before you? I know that, and I think that our listeners and viewers will understand this when I say it, but I know that you're responsible for putting some quote unquote Pete's in prison. And so can we talk about some of those cases?
Yeah. And I understand that's how people would describe it. I wouldn't say I'm responsible for putting people in prison. I would say I'm responsible for securing justice to where certain perpetrators' conduct have earned them their just reward.
That's true.
Perfect.
I'm just being honest about that.
Yeah.
And I said this from the very beginning. I believe and still believe that my time serving as a prosecutor, that the Lord assigned me to that position for that time period. And I was a part of God's design of government being his instrument for securing justice temporally for people who have been victimized by the depravity of sinful man. Romans 13 tells us very plainly, and it's important that people understand that Romans 13 comes within the context. Romans chapter 11 and Romans chapter 12. In Romans 12, the Lord instructs the believer to refuse to secure justice from a vigilante standpoint, because the Lord said himself, justice is mine, I will repay. And then the page turns to chapter 13, and the Lord says, oh, and by the way, government is my instrument of justice. And so government is the mechanism that God has ordained for justice to be secured temporally, because it involves fallen man. It will never be perfect, but we must never refuse to recognize the fact that God is the one who said that government is his instrument for securing justice on this side of eternity. And we should recognize that. And so I saw myself participating in that process. Also, just as an aside, many people hear about, how corrupt justice is, law enforcement, criminal prosecution is corrupt. And I saw the Lord calling me into that arena, in that system for a while, to be an agent of righteousness in the midst of what is largely and oftentimes, don't say large, but it's oftentimes perceived as being an unjust system. And so I saw myself serving the Lord through that particular profession for that time of my life.
So when you get these cases that come across your desk, because there was one in particular that you used to kind of illustrate the importance of understanding the proximity that perpetrators want to children, and how, under the guise of being a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but that these are often family members. What can you tell us about cases to help us understand some of the details and how these things play out? Even with, if we were to hold some of the information that you shared today up against some of the public information that we have out there. One of the things that struck me in talking with you about this on Sunday was that, man, there's so much overlap. Like, there's so much similarity in the details. It's almost like there is a demonic underpinning behind like the attack, the assault of children.
Yeah. And I'll say it, and I can say this plainly, because this is not false information. This is factual information. And I'm not saying this to be slanderous, but there's one defendant who's serving a life sentence right now in Angola prison in Louisiana. And it resonated with me because it was one of the last trials I had before coming on joining AFA. It's a defendant by the name of Joshua Burks. And I can say his name because it's a factual case. He was tried at a court of law, convicted at trial, exhausted his appeals, and he's serving time in the penitentiary right now. What listeners may be and viewers may be shocked to learn is that the concept of a stranger perpetrating CSA is a very rare phenomenon in the law enforcement community. Usually, perpetrators of CSA are known, trusted people. I'm talking about family members, friends of family, boyfriends. I hate to say it, but it's true. Uncles, stepdads, and there are circumstances where you have female perpetrators of CSA, but largely, and it is often males who are perpetrators of it. And I want to stress that the concept of a stranger doing it is very, very rare. Talk to any police officer, talk to any detective, they will tell you the exact same thing that I'm telling you. It's one of the things that before I ever even had a wife on the radar, through my experience as a prosecutor, I said, Lord, I am not allowing my children to have sleepovers for that very reason. It's not because I don't want my children to have fun, but the phenomenon of close associate abuse is a very real and unfortunately frequent phenomenon, and so that was a case in this. And when we talk Sunday, this is a case I raised because it was fresh on my mind. Now this case I prosecuted in 2014. We're in 2024, and I still remember a lot of the details of it. This defendant found a young lady who was a single mom. It's just the reality. He ingratiated himself to her, presented himself as if he was pursuing her. He happened to be not frequently employed, and so he often cared for her children in her home. In the process, he ultimately, and just to get right to it, groomed. Frankly, I'll just talk about the one case that there's a conviction for. Groomed the eventual victim, and he abused her. He abused her.
Can I pause you for a second to ask a question? When you say that this criminal groomed the victim, what can you share with us about how that looks, just generally speaking? What is grooming behavior?
Grooming behavior generally is a process that perpetrators and abusers often employ to get children in the CSA context comfortable with allowing the perpetrator access to their bodies, and for the potential or prospective victim to become comfortable with the perpetrator's bodies. Children don't have a concept for physical intimacy, so they don't often know what is happening, but there are certain, I'll call it relational proximity protocols that are breached over time. Let Uncle so I just want to tickle you a little bit, or come close, come sit on my lap. And often those things progress, and oh, look, I showed you this part of my body. Now you have to show me. I showed you my leg. Now let me show me your leg. I've showed you this part of my body. Now let me see these are kinds of things. And this is generally speaking, but there is often a progression in terms of the intimate boundaries, hand on, certain hand on knee, then hand on thigh, and then hand on inner thigh, and these kind of things over time. It's never all at once. It happens over time. In this particular case, in the Burks case that I prosecuted, this is literally what happened over time. And then once a vital boundary was breached, I should say, then it is accompanied by, now this is between you and me. Don't tell anybody. You're out of trouble if somebody found out what you were doing. This is our little secret. You don't want to hurt mommy this way. These kinds of things are a part of the conversation where you create a social environment between the abuser and the abused of secrecy. And that environment often is what is established as the grooming progresses into abuse. And I would argue that the grooming is a part of the abuse, I would argue.
Yeah.
Yes. So with this particular case that you're talking about, can you share the ages of the children? I know that you shared with me that there were other victims, but there was one victim around which the trial revolved, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, you're
Can you
absolutely right.
share? Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So it's often the case, unfortunately, with CSA perpetrators, they often have profiles to where certain ages are their preference, which is, it's just wicked even to say. I don't even like saying it, but that's the truth. And in this particular case, this suspect, and I'll say it this way, was accused of abusing several of this woman's children, starting with the oldest, and then moved to the next one, then to the next one. But the younger children were unable to testify cogently in court. And so the prosecution rested on one victim, though I know, and I had evidence that indicated the behavior had been repeated with other victims. But the one victim had the wherewithal to, I would say, endure the rigors of a trial where defendants are afforded by our Constitution a constitutional right to confront witnesses against them. So what I'm saying is that this little girl, I had to put her on the witness stand, and she had to testify in open court as to what transpired in her particular case. Now, the one thing that is a benefit, and we'll get to know that there is a process that once allegations are made, an investigation has started. Children are aided with mental health professionals and sociological professionals. In Louisiana, it's called the Children's Advocacy Center. In Texas, it's called the Children's Assessment Center or Advocacy Center. But they have them all over the country. CACs, because of the prevalence of CSA, that they create an environment that is safe, that is hospitable, that is welcoming and child-friendly, to allow children to speak cogently about what may or may not have happened. And the goal is not to accuse anybody. The goal is just simply to get to the truth. And this is something that happened in my case, where you had a forensic interviewer who interviewed the child on, this is all recorded, and using, anatomically correct dolls, using child-friendly language, even a play environment, was able to elucidate from the child what happened, even to the point, and this was one of the key components in my particular case, to where this little girl, this little girl was able to describe the victim's genitalia with a particular identifiable mark that was not obvious unless, and I want to be careful, was not obvious unless the genitalia wasn't flaccid.
Gotcha.
Okay?
I gotcha.
And it was located in a position that wasn't obvious unless the child was close to it. This is something, I'm just telling you plainly, that we executed a search warrant to get a picture of the defendant, and I put the picture on the display screen in court, open court, before the jury, so they can see what is actually on his body. And when they first heard the video from the CAC of the little girl testifying and drawing the mark, and it's right here. And when they compared the video that this little girl recorded to the picture I showed them in open court, it ultimately contributed to this defendant being convicted.
Wow. So a question that I have, as far as the little lamb girl, this would be the process that she would have to go through, like the questioning and stuff like that, because from what we've read, like, she became like a lockbox. She didn't remember things, or it's to a point where she's kind of closed off. But what you're saying is that she would at some point have to be questioned and have to kind of go through what happened and have to relive some of this stuff.
Unfortunately, yes, but it wouldn't be like from in a cold room with the detective standing over you. It is the children's advocacy centers and the children's assessment centers exist for this exact purpose. And so, to kind of illustrate the way it often would happen, in my case, Dr. Jackson was one of the people who helped me in this particular case. That the little girl would be invited into a room. If you would see one of these videos, it's like a children's playroom, almost like, I know y'all are familiar with the Children's Museum in New Orleans. I don't know if you remember that. There will be a room like it's in the Children's Museum in New Orleans. I know the listeners and viewers may not know what that is, but I know different states have children's museums in there. And it will begin with the forensic interviewer really just introducing themselves to the child, playing with the child, learning, what do you like to do? What are some of your hobbies? And these are people who are trained to do this. This is not like some random person. And then, like I mentioned, there are anatomically correct dolls that are there. And one of the major things that the forensic interviewers are trained to refuse to do is to lead the child. So you don't ask leading questions. A leading question is a question that suggests the answer in the midst of the question. For example, a leading question would be, Mickey, you love Will, don't you? Well, I'm suggesting your answer to my question in the question. A non-leading question would be, Mickey, tell me how do you feel about Will? It's open.
Gotcha.
Inviting and open-ended. So
now let me ask a question about that.
Yeah,
let me ask a question about that, Abe. Is that because children are impressionable, or is that just because just ethically you just don't do that in general? Is it specific to children?
It's not specific to children. It's both because children are impressionable, but as I told you, the goal of criminal justice is not to just convict people, is to see that justice is done. So what is true? Even in court, and many people have seen these on TV, television shows, objection, Your Honor, leading. In a court proceeding, if I'm putting on a case, I can't ask my witnesses leading questions on direct examination. Because again, my job is not to suggest to the witness what they should say. My job is to find out what actually happened. And so that is something that is true ethically and considering children, but it's something that continues all the way through to the trial presentation in an open court for direct examination.
Let me ask you this. I'm curious to know the youngest age at which a child could, and I don't even know if advocate is the right word, like how young can a child be that child is then bringing the charge or the accusation? I guess what I'm asking ultimately is, what is the responsibility of the parent? Because even if the child cannot verbalize what happened to him or her, if the parent knows something, if the parent senses something, how can that parent advocate and defend and protect that child, though the child can't speak for himself or herself?
Yeah. And so and this is, again, something people need to understand. It's not commonly comprehended in popular discourse, but when an allegation of criminality is made, the charging party ultimately is the state. It's not the individual. So the parent's role, if there is a reason to believe some type of abuse has occurred, is to report that to law enforcement. We have all kinds of laws concerning who are mandatory reporters of these kinds of things, and to allow law enforcement to conduct an appropriate investigation. And concerning the age of the children, it varies based on the communication capacity and the makeup of children. Some children, they can be the same age and they have different makeups. I have another experience, and I remember I told Will about this case a long time ago. This was in Harris County, and the little girl had no clue what was happening. But this was another situation, a single mom, live-in boyfriend, and the perpetrator groomed the child and sought opportunities to care for the child when mom was away, but it's just caring for the child, babysitting, and he got to the place where they played a game. And this was one of my cases. This little baby said this on the video. This little girl was 4 years old.
Oh.
And when she's on the video, she's 4. This started before she was 4, guys. They would play a game and the perpetrator would reward the child by giving her jelly or Jello. Yes. And I'm not going to be too graphic, but the Jello or jelly was placed on a particular location.
Oh, okay.
That was a reward when the girl did well. Now, again, the child has no clue what is happening.
Right.
It's evil.
It's wicked. It's wicked. The child had no clue what was happening. But that's literally how she described it. No, I love when I play this game, and when I do really, really good, when I win, I get a reward. Do you want to know what my reward is? I don't want to be graphic unnecessarily. But these are the kinds of things that happen.
Wow. I think people are, when we're trekking with you, so I think people can understand, you know what I mean? And But again, I think for so many of us who are observing, it's again, as you describe it, the popular discourse that's happening around it. We don't have a concept for this. And indeed, Abe, you've shared with us how, during your time as a prosecutor, you'd have to go walk the streets of the city and pray because of all of the things that you had coming across your desk. I mean, it's just, we don't have the capacity. When I think of God everywhere, all the time, in all places, beholding all of the things, we just don't, as humans, have the capacity for that. I do want to ask you something, though. I want to back up here, because as we're looking at what's going on, and then the questions that arise, going back to the case that you tried in New Orleans, where the defendant was ultimately prosecuted and is serving time in Angola. How did the charges come to be brought against him? What happened? What came from the children? And if you can share, what were their ages at the time?
Yeah, and just to be clear, just more precise, it was a Jefferson Parish case.
Okay.
But what happened is the oldest girl told her mom that I have to tell you something. But now the abuse started when the little girl was like 5. The grooming started before then, but the first instance of what was finally a charged crime started when she was 5, but she didn't say anything until she was like 7. And that's called in the law enforcement community, we understand, call that delayed outcry. There are cases when the delayed outcry is even much longer than that. You'll have a situation with a victim who was abused as a child and didn't say anything until they're teenagers or even adults, and there are laws covered in delayed outcry and how do you prosecute those cases. But the child, several years after the abuse began, told her mom, and the mom actually was mad at her daughter, didn't believe her daughter. And for weeks, the mom didn't do anything with it. And then the mom finally told her mom, which would be the victim's grandmother, what the little girl said. Almost like, can you believe this? And the unfortunate reality is the mom was very reluctant to believe it, because she didn't want to believe that her man, so to speak, the man that she is invested in romantically, would have any eyes toward her own child, So she actually didn't believe the child initially. And the grandmother is the one who insisted that the mother contact the police, to the place where he said, if you don't call them, I'm going to call them. And if I'm the one who have to call them, you're going to have some problems. And so the mom and the grandmother contacted the police together.
That's very interesting, by the way, what you just highlighted there, given the current situation, that there is an outrage to the extent that it forces the hand of the mother. The grandmother steps in as the voice of wisdom. And in this particular case, a certain level of discernment to say, no, you don't just ignore the child. Like, let's go through the proper channels and see what happened. Okay. So then what happens after that?
Yeah. And so here's another thing that's an interesting fact in the case that I prosecuted, in this Burst case that I'm referring to. The little girl didn't go into all of the details. She just told mom generally that when you're away, he does bad things to me. It was not until the mom, I'm telling you this because I spent a lot of time with this family. The mom did not believe the girl until she watched the girl's CAC interview. And it wasn't until her daughter described her living boyfriend's anatomy that she realized, and mom broke in the office after watching her child on video explain what she's suffered, she suffered.
Wow.
Abe, why is it
Serious
so difficult for family members to believe the outcries of victims?
Yeah, it goes back to what I said about the statistical probability. Usually when CSA occurs, these are trusted people, so they for whatever reason, they feel that in the instances that I've encountered personally, this is anecdotal, but also statistically, there are studies to support what I'm saying here. Because of the trust and comfort level that the adults have with the accused party, that they are slow or reluctant to believe the allegations. There's also a bit of kind of cognitive dissonance, because people can know generally these things happen, but nobody wants to think, well, this has happened to me or happened to my child. And then you also have the reality often when it is like a single mom with a live-in boyfriend or someone that they don't want to reconcile that a person who they are romantically invested in could have a similar type of investment in anyone generally, let alone a child, anyone else generally, let alone their child, not just a child, but their child or their close relative.
I know that you are, and I want to make a shift here. I know that you are familiar with the Roy's report and the information that's around the allegations that are out there. I know that you have told us that a person's defense against charges of slander or defamation would be the truth, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I want to get you to talk to, because I do feel like there's a lot of conversation about the use of, in this case in particular, the use of the pseudonym Pete. And I know that the Roy's report, they kind of started that. And it was, we are using the name Pete because there have not been charges, brought against this individual. Is there any legal requirement if we are using allegation, if we are using the accused, and it's, I mean, my goodness, it is, it's a public kind of conversation, I feel like, that's happening. Is there any reason that we need to continue using this pseudonym when we have very clearly identified the victim in this case?
Yeah, and I'll just say you can use a pseudonym as a matter of courtesy, but you're not legally obligated to do so if the publicly available evidence shows that this is who the accused is. And I mentioned to you that defamation is a tort that includes both libel and slander. Libel would be the publication of a false statement concerning a person or a party in print, in writing. Slander would be the publication of false information about a person or party verbally. Okay. The number one defense to a defamation claim is this is true. You can't assert a civil tort claim of defamation when somebody says something is true. Like if I were to say, Mickey, she's married to Will. You can't say Abe defamed me. Well, it's not defamation. It's the truth. Even if you don't want the world to know you're married to Will, the great.
So let me ask you this then.
If it's true.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. If it's true. So again, it could be out of a matter of courtesy, and I understand if this particular outlet has a policy to where they won't use the accused name unless there are formal criminal charges that have been filed. That's a personal policy decision, but that's not something that's legally required. And in this instance, I believe there's evidence to show that they're calling the accused Pete, but they're identifying his wife by her real name.
Right.
And the wife is actually out defending Pete, her husband.
Yeah. So the wife in her real name is defending her own husband and saying that my husband is Pete. Right. I mean, it's I understand.
Well, I think by default, I wouldn't say that she's come out and said my husband is Pete,
but she is
defending Pete and revealing information that only the wife of Pete could know.
Yeah.
And and sharing that outrightly. And then also when you have counselors who have been up close and personal, who are talking about having met with Pete and his wife, and then saying, and so then Rachel,
this is his wife.
It sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. And here's another component. When you are a public person, the standard to uphold a slander claim, a defamation claim, is elevated, because when you're public, you make yourself more readily accessible to the public. One of the major things, one of the recent defamation cases that may be in people's memory was Nicholas Sandmann from Covenant Christian School. Remember the situation when he was in Washington, D.C., and he ultimately sustained he filed a defamation lawsuit against CNN, Washington Post, a bunch of these out, New York Times, and all that, and then he won an undisclosed settlement amount. One of the major things is that Nicholas Sandmann was a private person, and when you have a public person, in order to sustain a defamation claim, it would not only be a false statement offered publicly, but also in reckless disregard of the truth. So again, what is true? Um, and I don't want to encroach on anybody's consciences. If they feel convicted that they want to be, as discreet as possible, okay, that's fine, but don't present it as if you're legally required to do so, because that's not a legal mandate at this juncture when you have the wife identified publicly. And I believe some people even identify the child publicly. Like, you're going to
Yes.
afford this potential accused, if not formally accused, more discretion than you would even afford the child. That is
You know,
Yeah.
the
unconscionable.
thing that I don't understand in it is that the wife of the accused is also defending her husband publicly at the expense of the child's privacy. Like, she is actually naming the child and talking about different issues with the child as a means by which to defend her husband. And so I feel like we have the allegations on the table. We can use all the allegedlys. We can use accused, to cover our bases here. But I feel like if you've got this child, that this very public record of probably one of the darkest times in her life, it's going to be out there forever. I just don't understand why we're showing more care for the alleged offender than we are the victim, right? The one who said to her parents that something happened with her.
Yeah, and man, so two things. One, by God's grace, we live in the United States of America. We have a Bill of Rights. We have the Fifth Amendment, that, contrary to the legal system in Europe and other places, if a person is accused of a crime, the formal charging party has a responsibility of proving that crime. So we live in a country to where allegations are allegations until they are proven in a court of law. So I understand, appreciate, and respect the necessity of using allegedly, but to afford a prospective potential offender more discretion, care, and concern than the child is unconscionable to me. Because, getting back to the main question, is there justice available for this child? You have the ultimate issue of justice in the court of law, but you also have the lower rungs, if you will, in a cascading, almost like scaffolding concept of justice. The first rung of that is, how does this baby's parents respond to her? And if one of the parents is the accused party, the only other one in the parental sphere is the mom. How does mom respond to her? Even if you want to defend your husband, will you not offer care and discretion for your child? To make this accessible to people in the popular discourse, I don't think we properly understand how the immediate parental response impacts that child. Then, moving out from the relational dynamics, how do the grandparents respond? How do family members respond? Are they willing to sacrifice this child, and the child's development and the child's disposition? Because it's one thing, it's a vital step to secure justice in courts of law, but then there's life that has to be lived thereafter. There's a relational dynamic. I have wept with children who say, I can't believe for all these years my mom wouldn't believe me. It took you to help my mom to see what really happened to me.
Man.
I've been in the room with that. I've been in the room with the child. Mr. Abe, how do I go forward? Because now I feel like my mom is going to be mad at me for the rest of my life because I ruined her dream.
Yeah.
I ruined her image of her happily ever after. And I think we underestimate and diminish the significance of that. It's a great detriment, frankly.
Well, let me ask you this, going to the parents, right? So in the Daystar situation, it is said that Joni told Susie don't call the police. One question I have is that illegal for there to be something that is said to have happened in this sphere and not to call the police? And then also, far as the father, and both of us, we're fathers, is concerned. When you look at the response of Jonathan, does anything that he did kind of sound questionable to you? Not immediately calling the police, or even, coming to the defense of his daughter in a way that would seem to be, I don't know. I'm just having problems, with that, like trying to figure out the mindset of what's going on. So is it illegal? Could it be seen as illegal not to call the police in a situation like this?
Yeah, you have the, let me just say this. There's nothing that obligates a grandmother to compel her daughter to call the police. That's nothing legally required. You do have the issue of whether or not, Daystar, and I don't know what their nonprofit status is. If they are representing themselves as a church, then principals and the church could have an obligation to be mandatory reporters. You have a general Texas state provision that says if an adult is aware of just CA, not just the CSA, but CA, they have a duty to communicate that to the police. But it just and it's sad, but that's not an infrequent phenomenon where you have family members say, "Oh no, we don't want to get the police involved in this."
Yeah.
And I just it smacks, if that is what has transpired as has been reported, and the circumstances when that transpires, it just shows that some people have elevated interest above the concern for the potential victim, and that's a
sad part.
That's a grating notion to consider, on the part of the father. Man, I'm a human being, I understand family ties and all of that, but I'm sorry, nobody comes before my child. I often say on my show, my full-time job is my family. Before I'm serving the public, before I'm serving, a local church, before I'm serving any public capacity, my family comes first. And there are other things just as a father, and I don't know if we're going to get there, but if I find out some dude is in the room with my child, my 5-year-old, 4-year-old, and child is my child is naked. I ain't in the hood no more, but I'm from there. And I'm not trying to say, that advocating for violence and things of that nature, but that's
but there is a sense in, I was going to say there is a sense in which there is an assault though that has happened. So I know we feel like, okay, we're not advocating for violence, but I think there is a righteous anger that should come over a person in certain circumstances.
Well, there's a righteous anger, and there's law that allows for the self-defense. A lot of people know about self-defense, but there's also called defense of others, defense of property, to where you are legally allowed to defend another if they're an imminent threat or harm of being assaulted. That the law provides for that,
We were talking earlier about grooming behavior, and I asked you this on Sunday. We were talking about grooming behavior, and so just you are familiar with the details of the allegations that surround the Lamb/Brown situation, okay? And the allegations are out there, or the account is out there, that Susie Lamb, the wife of Jonathan Lamb, the mother of the victim, I guess I should say the alleged victim, she says that she was told that her daughter walked in on the person who's being accused here, okay? And he told her, hey, she walked in on me. Sorry, it's full frontal nudity. I'm sorry, she just walked in on me. And every time I've heard Susie Lamb describe that, she describes it that way, as if it were just sort of a casual retelling of like what a person ate for breakfast. Sorry, hey, she walked in on me. Just want to let you know, just she walked in on me. So you have that, and you put that in sort of like one hand. And then on the other hand, you fast forward, and now the same individual with the same child is in the room. This time the child is naked. When we talk about grooming behavior, help us understand from your background, what would be the reason for the child to have stumbled in on this individual with full frontal nudity, full exposure to this child?
Okay. First of all, I'm a dad. I got 6 children. I never had any child stumble upon full front. Anyway, I have, and I'm just going to I have had cases that I have prosecuted. The one we referred to included a time when mom remembered, you know what, I did think it was kind of weird because randomly, Josh, that's what they called him, he said, oh yeah, by the way, so-and-so, they walked in on me. And I was like, what? What did you do? I mean, just like acting like it's like nothing. Remember what I described earlier. Often grooming behavior includes a progressing in interaction for the perpetrator to make the potential victim comfortable increasingly with their bodies and for them to become increasingly comfortable with the victim's bodies. I have had cases, not a case, more than one case where the perpetrator at some point in the interaction describes himself as, or describes a scenario where the child has, oh, they just seen me naked, or they just came in on this and they've just done this. And in the cases that I have handled, those encounters have been pursued in the course of doing what I just described earlier, increasing the comfort levels with disrobed bodies, both of their own and ultimately of the child, either partially or even fully. That is consistent. That type of conduct is consistent with what I have experienced in my own career with people who have done things like that, articulated circumstances like that in the course of the grooming process. I'm just telling you, that's just the truth.
Yeah. I think you can't be in a place. I just don't understand the people of God. And remember, we're talking about people in whom the Holy Spirit dwells. So there's a certain amount of discernment that is available to us as believers, right? And I think to intentionally dumb that down to a place where you say those things are just coincidences, like you don't need to read too much into that. I think we do ourselves a disservice and we ignore, or well, maybe it's questionable if it's true, but we ignore the Holy Spirit who's indwelling us, right? Who would make us alert, who would make us watchful, that who would allow us to be perceptive. Abe, I want to also ask you this question. Again, based on your experience, when you have these CSA cases and you have these CSA offenders, when the victim finally makes his way to you, is it the perpetrator's first time usually?
Unfortunately, no. By the time I have a file on my desk with a defendant's name on it, case file, police report, I have never had a case where it was the offender's first time doing that. Again, that's anecdotal, but that is 10 years worth of prosecution. And no, and when you take like what you described, the factual scenario, and if my chronology is right, you have an earlier allegation by a little girl that leads initially the parents and even grandma to think that this is happening at school, that what she suffered happened from someone at school. And then subsequent to that, you have the scenario where, oh, just walked in on me, as it has been reported publicly. The allegations include, and then even after that, the little girl, as has been reported in what's alleged in the Roy story and other places, that the little girl is going to change to go swim, but this guy's like, oh, and follows her while she's going to change to go swim. And wife alerts dad that this is happening, and then dad ascends to the room where little girl is changing and finds his own daughter in the room naked.
Right.
And this man is in the room with this little girl. So one of the legal standards that we employ is evaluating conduct within the totality of the circumstances, because one instance is an instance in isolation, but an incident within the totality of the circumstances gives you a broader picture as to what has transpired or what could have transpired. I would simply tell you, if these allegations are true, as if they've been reported, as a prosecutor, it reminds me of cases that I have handled where convictions for CSA have followed. That type of pattern is consistent with what I have seen in cases that have been sustained. I'm not saying it automatically means the allegations are true, but I'm telling you that that pattern is consistent with what I have seen in cases that have resulted in criminal convictions.
There's been a lot of talk, Abe, about a quote unquote Pete being cleared and exonerated. And, you know, if you look at the timeline, Marcus Lamb, who died in November of 2021, set up for his family to undergo counseling because of these allegations, which is why I'm a little bit, I have to say, just personally, it upsets me when people say that Jonathan and Susie never cared about their daughter. They never did. It's just factually untrue, because what we do know is that it started to splinter the family, that you had other members of the family who said, no, we've actually seen some behavior in the accused that gives us cause for pause, to the extent that they said, we're not going on vacation with him. He cannot come over to our house and be around our children. This is a major issue. So what we know is that the family, under the, I guess, direction or mandate of Marcus Lamb before he died, had to undergo counseling. So they go to see this counselor. Denise Boggs is her name. Ultimately, what happens is that she refers them to a licensed professional counselor who does forensic assessments on potential CSA. Okay. And the accused and his wife agree to that assessment, to undergo that assessment. I want to play a clip for you, and I want to get your take on it, because Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson has done an incredible job in bringing in the firsthand accounts of these people who have been involved. And I think it's important, as we are assessing this and thinking about this, and I know with your prosecutorial background, you know the scope of what is admissible in court, what is inadmissible, what people have the authority to do, and what they don't have the authority to do. But I want to have you listen to a little bit of the conversation where the licensed professional counselor who was involved in the forensic assessment talks about, you know, this idea of being able to exonerate or excuse the accused. Look at this, and then we'll kind of talk about it after.
One of the things that immediately Pete and his wife said to Miss Denise Boggs was they wanted to be cleared. First of all, they said they were exonerated, but Miss Denise has confirmed that that was absolutely not true, as have you confirmed that's not true. But Miss Denise kept getting asked by Pete if she would write a letter for him. In fact, he said, just put something on professional paper, just do it on letterhead and it'll be fine. And she says, I can't do that. In your estimation, could Miss Denise Boggs, with her credentials, be able to clear Pete in any way?
No. No. She is a pastor and has the heart of a pastor, but there is nothing in her educational background that would allow her to do that. And so she very correctly told him that she could not do that.
And in
Just
fact,
like I can't clear him. No.
And would you be able to forensically clear someone at some point, or is that not really a thing?
No, it really isn't. A forensic counselor can only give an opinion to the court if they ask for one. And they choose whether to take that or not take that opinion into account.
Okay, so Abe, so your take on that you just saw from Debbie Lynn Hart, the licensed professional counselor who did the forensic sort of assessment,
Mhm.
in which, we have other clips. She says she couldn't even really do an effective assessment
Mhm.
because the wife was present and the wife was answering questions on behalf of the husband. And then also Denise Boggs, another counselor, was present. So you have four people in a room, based on your experience and your, what you saw or what is legal. What is and isn't supposed to happen in a situation like this, and then what could be the expected outcome?
Yeah. So just to be clear, so Linhart and Boggs were in the room together.
Yes, as
Okay.
as Linhart interviewed, quote unquote, Pete, and
Yeah.
his wife was also there.
Yeah. So first, it's noteworthy to me that this alleged Pete has requested from uh, one of the mental health professionals a letter saying that he's been cleared or whatever. The simple fact is, private counselors can't exonerate anybody. Exoneration doesn't come from private counselors. Acquittals are determined in courts of law, um, or law enforcement entities refuse to prosecute cases, refuse to file charges. Private therapists cannot. They do not have the capacity. They are institutionally incapable of exonerating anybody. So for anyone to say that a private counselor has exonerated someone who has been accused of criminality, that they've been exonerated from that criminal accusation, that is a flat lie. It's just a flat lie. That you cannot secure exoneration from a private therapist. At best, what private therapists can offer, and this is important to note, the offering would ultimately be made in a court of law. It would be their opinion. Secondarily, any interview conducted by law enforcement would only consist of an individual participant. There is never a scenario where a detective would interview an accused party with their wives present. That would never happen. In the scenario where an interview is conducted with more than one party present, wouldn't be admissible in the court of law. It wouldn't be, especially when you have a scenario when questions are offered to a party and then the party's wife is answering the questions. That there is no scenario where that would be allowable evidence admitted into a court of law.
What, based on your understanding of, the kinds of cases and the characters that make up those cases, what is the motivation potentially, okay, of someone who is in a situation where he is accused of SA? What would be the motivation that I need someone to clear me? I need to, if the person is truly innocent. There's also information out there that the person was told you would have to go through more assessments. Like there needs to be more meetings. Like you can't just after one assessment be declared, oh, I don't find any reason to suspect that you committed this crime. What would be the reason that the person would say, I'm not doing that again? It was too grueling. I'm not going through that again. Can you just write me a letter clearing me? And then also, I'll just throw this on. What would be the reason that the wife of the accused would be doing all of the talking and not the person who is actually being accused? I mean, even out on social media, the husband is silent, but the wife is doing all of the talking in defense of the accused.
Man. So a couple things. I want to clarify something I said before.
Okay.
If an accused party, in that scenario, we have 4 people present and is reported as having said something, that's a statement against his interests could potentially be admitted as an exclusion to hearsay rules. But the content of the interview in and of itself won't be allowable in court. You would have to testify to whatever was said then in open court. And the same thing with the wife would have to testify in open court. It wouldn't be that in exchange itself would be, okay, here, take this, and this is the testimony. Now, to the question you just asked, as I mentioned earlier, that our country, we have the Fifth Amendment. You have a privilege against self-incrimination. People are popularly aware of says, I plead the Fifth. I plead the Fifth. That would be the invocation of one's right under the Fifth Amendment, which is a privilege against self-incrimination. What that privilege means is that no charged party can be compelled to testify against themselves, okay? So you do have that as a reality. However, practically, and this has also been my experience, in circumstances where an accusation is presented and a party is consistently asserting their innocence, that I have seen those parties often want to talk. I want to tell you, I don't care how many times it takes. This didn't happen, and this is why it didn't happen, and this is where I was, and this is how it was. There's no such thing as it being too grueling, especially
Right.
when you have been falsely accused of something so egregious.
Right.
It is as a prosecutor, it's interesting to me and noteworthy to me that, oh, this process is too grueling. But give me a letter saying that I'm good, but I'm not talking to you again. You know, it's very interesting. I'll mention there's another case that I prosecuted. I won't get into a long story. It's a homicide case, and this is again in Louisiana. That after the defendant, and I can say he committed this because he's been tried and convicted. He's also spending time in Angola in prison. After he committed the homicide, he immediately got in his car and fled to Houston, Texas. I asked the judge in that trial of that case for an instruction to the jury that allows me to argue that flight post crime commission can be viewed by the jury as evidence of guilt. Flight post commission is evidence of guilt. And so I illustrated for the jury the defendant in that case's trajectory, because we were able to get his cell phone data from towers that ping as he fled on I-10 West, leaving the New Orleans area, heading to Houston, Texas, to show at each time where he was on I-10, where he called from, where his cell phone pinged, what towers he was using at those times. And the judge allowed my jury instruction. Criminal practitioners all around the country will tell you that flight post-commission often can be used in a trial to assess one's guilt or innocence as evidence of potential guilt. Simply put, the Bible says the wicked flee when no man pursue. The Bible says the wicked flee when no man pursue. Meaning there's nobody's even coming after you, but you're running. The Bible query would be, what you're running for?
Right.
And the Bible also gives the reasoning. They're running because they're wicked. The wicked flee. The flee is because of the wickedness, not because of the pursuit. The wicked flee when no man pursues. So again, I'm not saying this is a conclusive fact that this is what he's doing, but it is interesting to me that he sat previously for an interview with his vice president, with his wife answering all the questions, refusing to do anything else. But I want you to send me a letter saying that I'm cleared.
Wow.
That is it's interesting to note. Again, if the reports are accurate as to what's been reported,
sure,
that's an interesting fact to consider within, as I said earlier, the totality of the circumstances as to what all has been alleged to date.
I want to ask you to kind of role play a little bit here, Abe, if you don't mind, because again, as much as we would like to pretend that we are not trying to, litigate this publicly, there's some public courtroom happening, right? There are people saying things like, well, the wife has released pictures and videos of the accuser. And when I say the accuser, I'm speaking of the parents of the victim, right? Acting in her stead, saying something happened. And we have reason to believe that it is this person based on all of the circumstantial evidence that surrounds his being with our child. We also have evidence that he would visit our home when we weren't there, and it made the babysitter uncomfortable. And so they have that out there. There are people who are saying, well, you know what? If he really believed that his daughter was a victim, speaking of Jonathan Lamb here, then why post that accusation or post, that concern? Is he just, buddying it up with him around town, riding in cars? Why are they playing golf together? Why are they continuing on together? That says that the child is not a victim. And this is not a story. And so we all need to move on. This is something that has been contrived because Jonathan Lamb wanted to be president of Daystar. As a prosecutor, if someone made that claim in a court of law and said, well, even after the child was supposedly or allegedly victimized, you remained friends. You guys are still friends and buddies. So did you fear for your child's safety? How would you handle that?
Yeah, I'd want to know what the factual scenario is. I would interview the dad, see what's going on. Like, what is this true? First of all, is this true? Have you had any changes in your perception and or conduct with the accused party after the accusation has come to the surface? And what changes have transpired? You know, have you remained buddy-buddy? Do you allow your daughter around this person? You know, I would want to find out what happened from them directly. You know, to undercut the speculation, I would want to talk to him directly.
Yeah. 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 I think it's interesting too. I think what a lot of people are not taking into consideration, and again, your understanding of the law is going to put some of the details in the category of like, you know, it's preposterous to even try to formulate an opinion around that because you know the law so well, right? But there are people who would say they believed that the counselors cleared him, right? Because immediately following that interview, the wife then sent a text message to her dad, Marcus Lamb, who was living at the time, obviously, saying, hey, quote unquote, Pete, but not at the time, Pete, right? My husband has been cleared, okay? They didn't find any reason to suspect that he was guilty of anything. And so he's been exonerated. And you have those text message, the information from that out now on the internet, that the dad then responded, you know, praise the Lord, you know, or something to that effect. Don't worry about telling the other four. Let the counselor and God be your defender. My question is then, could ignorance be a reason that a person might think, okay, I have to move on from this because this professional counselor has cleared? By the way, nobody followed up with the counselors. Yeah. Okay. In their own words, they say, Marcus Lamb called for all of the counseling sessions to end, believing that the accused had been cleared. And then Debbie Linhart said nobody followed up with her. She did not exonerate anyone, nor does she have the authority. And she knows she doesn't have the authority to do that, but there was no follow-up. It was the wife said he's cleared and everything stopped. Is it possible that Jonathan Lamb believed that and believed that that was sufficient for them to move on? And also, you read the articles coupled with the threats that if you continue on saying this, you can't be here.
Yeah, no doubt about it that ignorance could play a role in that. Yeah, and I find it just galling that someone hired these counselors. Who paid the counselors? And whoever paid the counselors, they didn't ask the people they hired as to whether or not what has been the outcome of this conversation. Like I just find that to be glaringly coincidental. Like, so nobody wants to ask the counselor themselves what was the result.
Right.
It seems as if whoever paid the counselors weren't interested in actually what the counselors thought, if they didn't ask them what happened after the fact. And then secondarily, no one can be exonerated from accusations from a potential victim without talking to the victim. Like, if I'm saying Will did something to me, no, Will would never do nothing to me. I'm just playing. I'm saying Will did something to me. Will did something to me, right? And I'm telling you, Will did something to me. But you only talk to Will. Will, Abe said you did something to him. What did you do to Abe? Will would say, man, that little punk, man, I ain't do nothing to that dude, man.
He would never.
And then you go, oh, that's golly gee, Will's been exonerated. Like just think about that. That's absurd on its face.
Sure.
That's absurd on its face. It seems to me that whoever paid the counselors and the people, and I do believe ignorance could have played a role in this, no doubt about it, but whoever paid the counselors weren't interested in the counselor's perspective. If they didn't even ask them after the fact, what happened? No, they didn't even ask them. And then not only did they not ask them, they do the opposite. End of sessions. It seems that they weren't interested in finding out the counselor's
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
That they were
Man,
trying to use the counselors. It seems that they were trying to use the
That's what it
counselors
seems like.
to just move
To move
in the
on.
direction that they wanted before they had ever hired the counselors.
Mhm.
I mean,
And
that's
that's-
the only objective assessment. Would you pay somebody to cut your grass? Then you don't go even see if your grass was cut.
Right. Right. Oh, come on. Right. Make it plain. Yeah.
Like, that doesn't make any sense if you actually
Yeah.
care about your grass being cut now.
Mhm.
There was something that you shared previously, and I want to get us to this point. But before I do, I want to take us back into the hypothetical realm, because I do want to be careful. I want to be responsible with the platform that the Lord has entrusted to us. So let me go back into the hypothetical realm. Okay. If you've got a close family member who, you know, says, we don't need to go to authorities with this, we can deal with this internally, you know, based on your experience as a prosecutor, especially when we're dealing with women, right?
Mhm.
What might be some of the reasons that a person might want to keep these things quiet? I mean, we understand there could be protection of image, of family name, of
Mhm.
personal relationship. You say, I don't want you to ruin this relationship that I have with my boyfriend. You know, this is going to break up the family. What might be some other reasons based on your
Yeah.
profession?
Yeah. One of the things that I found in my experience trying these cases, that when you have a potential, for example, female victim, a little girl or a woman victim, sometimes women who have been victims of SA or CSA, they sometimes are um, unnecessary. They project their own trauma upon the victim in the instance case sometimes, and sometimes in that projection, blame the victim for what they're alleging has happened to them. You know, sometimes because victims of CSA have been told, for example, by their perpetrator, this is your fault, this has happened. You shouldn't have come around me dressed like that. You shouldn't have sat in my lap. You shouldn't have done this to me. And sometimes victims of CSA or SA project their own trauma onto the victim. I've seen it many times, often in CSA cases and in domestic violence cases where there's physical battery. Sometimes when the victims are women or girls, women and girls can be harder on the victims than men. Often men in those scenarios respond with a protective instinct concerning the victim that sometimes victims of these instances don't share. I'm not saying
Mm.
conclusively and absolutely in all circumstances, but I'm saying many times that that happens. And so in addition to the concerns you mentioned before about reputation, occupational interests, monetary interests, there also sometimes can be a projection from one who has been victimized of their own experiences and own trauma in the instant case. That happens
Mm.
often, unfortunately.
Abe, based on some of the information that we have in front of us, and again, based on your history, can there be justice for the baby lamb? Like based on your professional understanding of how cases can be tried or can't be tried, like what would need to happen based on the information that you're privy to for there
Yeah.
to be justice for this little girl?
Yeah, the first thing that should happen, if it's not happened yet, is that it needs to be reported to law enforcement, and not law enforcement of any particular party's interest. They need to report it
Mm.
to the appropriate law enforcement within the jurisdiction where the allegations have occurred. That's the first thing that needs to happen. The concept of a family member interviewing a child who's alleged she suffered some kind of victimization, and the instruction or the result from that interview is that the child shuts down. I just want a child shutting down is not an uncommon phenomenon, which is why if there is concern for the girl, which there should be. When they're victims of these types of instances, one of the major things that's necessary for the victim to be able to progress with their lives and not be paralyzed perpetually by what they've suffered is that they need to have what God has ordained as his instrument for temporal justice to say, you know, what happened to you was not right. If this has happened, again, assuming that this happened, if this has happened, one of the major steps that's necessary for the victim to progress in life is to have a societal objection to what has transpired. So it needs to be reported to law enforcement. And again, law enforcement's job is not to conclude this has happened. It's to investigate whether or not it has happened. And in the investigation, there will be an ascertaining as to whether or not there's sufficient evidence to prove that this has happened. You know, it's not just what's your opinion on the matter. No, is there sufficient evidence to prove that this has happened? The process I described earlier, that when there are allegations made by children in circumstances like this, they have the benefit of CACs, child assessment centers, child advocacy centers, where you have trained professionals who are able to elicit information from children that oftentimes the child doesn't feel comfortable, or the environment doesn't exist for the child to reveal what truly has transpired until they're in an environment that's conducive to that. I told you in the case that I handled, the little girl was able to disclose far more in the CAC interview than she was able to even tell her own mom. Because even though children are intuitive. And so the little girl was able to ascertain that her disclosure may not be received with open arms immediately. She just, in really the height of her pain, just couldn't hold it anymore and said that he did something to me. So he did something bad. But when the child is in the CAC interview, the child was able to go into great detail. And again, the child not knowing what happened, but using anatomically correct dolls, saying this was placed here, and then this happened here, and how many times it happened? Well, it happened this long, and or how long was it happening? And the child didn't have any necessary concept of time, or say, well, when I was in this grade, this happened, and then because I was wearing this uniform at this time, and those kind of things. And these are details that familial conversation didn't bring to the surface. And these are details that came out as the child's comfort level and rapport had been established. But the simple fact is that these things happened. One of the major things I hadn't said yet, that in my case, now imagine this, the defendant's own mother ended up telling me that when I heard about what that little girl said my son did, I knew she was telling the truth.
Wow.
His own mother, you know. So what needs to happen for this little child, and it hurts, it breaks my heart that all of these adults is concerned about all these other things, and people seem to forget about the child.
Come on.
What about the child? What about the little baby? What about the girl? The girl needs to have, if this has happened, the girl needs to have the society surrounding her to agree that this was wrong.
Yes.
If this didn't happen, we don't need self-interested adults to conclude that. The same source of temporal accountability should say this, there's no evidence to sustain this. But you cannot secure exoneration from privately hired professionals who, by the way, will tell you, no, I didn't even say they was exonerated. I was told to shut it down, and there were no more interviews, and nobody asked me what happened in the interview that we did have.
You know, it's interesting because that counselor, says no one reached out to her after that interview. Not Joni Lamb, not Marcus Lamb. Nobody followed up. And, you know, I don't know. I just think, to the point that you're making, I would want to know. I would need to know. This is a member of my family.
Right.
And excuse me, there are other children. Involved. I need to know.
Yes.
As we wrap up, Abe, there was something, and I think it's fitting, and I'll tell you why I want to know about this. But you shared with us the main point of your closing arguments in the Burks case.
Yeah.
And there are people who are saying, you know, you guys talking about this and bringing out Pete's real name, you're ruining his life. Like, you are ruining a person's life, right? And I can't help but think about what your closing arguments were about, how we define the ruining of a life when we have alleged essay against a child.
Yeah. In the Joshua Burks case, the charges that he was indicted on included aggravated essay, which had within the sentence was a mandatory life sentence. That gives you an idea of the type of allegations that were made. And I know, as human beings, in some circumstances, there are people that have a visceral reaction when they learn that, wait a minute, you mean this is life, and just to be plain, life without the possibility of parole. So this is well, no, you may have some parole down the line, a long time later, but it's a life sentence. A life sentence was the sentence in this particular case. And I argued, and I said that to my jurors in the case. I said, I know when you have been impaneled as a juror and you've taken the oath as a juror and you're considering the severity of charges where the potential punishment, in this is an instance to where the punishment, like I said, is mandatory. There's no discretion to the court. If there's a conviction, there will be a life sentence. I told the jury, I said, I know that's a serious consideration. But I just want you to know that what you are considering as punishment for this perpetrator, frankly, is no different from what this little girl has already experienced. Regardless of what you do with this case here, this little child has already been given a life sentence. When this young lady grows up, her first kiss, this defendant will be there. When this lady grows up, the first time a young man pursues her romantically, this defendant will be there. On her wedding night, this defendant will be there. When this child has her own children, this defendant will be there. I want you to understand that what Joshua Burks has already sentenced this little girl to is a life sentence. I want you to know that. And so what I'm asking you to do is simply to hold him accountable for what I know we've proven that he has done. Because you are not putting him anywhere. His conduct is what has earned him his sentence. And I made that appeal to the jurors. And frankly, at that time, I had one daughter, and I thought about my own daughter. That this defendant has now intruded upon this little girl's life in such a way to where for the remainder of her life, he is a part of her life.
Wow.
Man, it's chilling. I appreciate you sharing that, Abe. I feel like that's what we need to keep in the forefront of our mind. There's been so much conversation here, and even the statement that recently came from Daystar, addressing the lies that are out there. And in that statement, there was no mention of the CSA that's kind of on the table, if you will. I don't mean to sound curt with that, but like this, there is a major allegation that is out there, and it has nothing to do with ascending to the presidency. It has nothing to do with $100,000 spent on a honeymoon. It has nothing to do with the Lamb family name and all of these things, but it's that someone in the family, and let me say this even in a bigger way, right? In the family of God, is alleged to have harmed a child, irreparably harmed a child. We in the body of Christ should care about the truth. We should care about justice for that little girl. And we should be pushing, man, is there going to be justice for this child? As sensational as some of the conversations want to be, the truth is that there needs to be justice for this little girl. Before we wrap up, Abe, any final thoughts on this?
Oh man, I have so many thoughts, but the main one is my heart is heavy for the little girl. My heart is heavy for the body of Christ. You mentioned earlier in our conversation about the necessity of discernment, and the scripture from Romans 12 comes to mind. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and prove what is the good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. And largely, and I don't mean this as a condemnation, because I am a member of the body of Christ in our country. But the body of Christ in our country is suffering from a grotesque lack of discernment, and is largely attributable to the level of worldliness that we're comfortable with in the church in our nation. The Apostle Paul explained in that text, Romans 12, 1 and 2, that the quality and the capacity with which we as believers refuse to be conformed to this world. And instead of being conformed, we are transformed by the renewing of our minds. As that transformation continues, our capacity for discernment increases. So the corollary opposite is that the more that we are worldly, the less discernment we will have, and so we have these ungodly considerations that blunt our discernment instead of being able to have a discernment that is refined by the white hot scrutiny of the Lord's word and the presence of his spirit in us. And instead of that being what guides our engagement, we have all these other considerations that are cutting in and encroaching upon us. And I just, my heart is heavy for my family and our nation, the eternal family.
Man, Abe, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking this time. This is, man, we love you as a brother. We love you as a friend. And it's going to be so good. I'm looking forward to it. Just to say, as we wrap up here, we're going to be working together, doing a date night. This is to uphold the institution of the family, one man, one woman, that God has already told us what marriage is. And so we're doing a date night on February 14th.
A double date night,
February 14th.
It's Valentine's Day.
You got it. Abe,
Valentine's. No.
You remember this brother making the announcements, couldn't remember when Valentine's Day was. I mean, we don't want to publicly shame him.
He don't remember that.
Because y'all have like a bro code.
And don't talk about my man like that.
I know. I'm sorry. You guys got to stick together. But anyway, I just want to encourage our listeners and our viewers, if you want to have a night where you guys come and we make much of marriage together, we'll have fun, but also it will be impactful, then you can go to cultureproof.net to learn more about that. I'll say the other thing, and we haven't opened registration for this yet, but as we were talking about, children and protecting them, I couldn't help thinking about our children's track and thinking about how we do background checks on people that work with our children, how we always have 2 adults in a room with our children, how important it is to protect them, because man, you don't get a do-over. You understand what I'm saying? So anyway, Abe, thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you guys for having me.
All right. When we resist those cultural trends that rival the truth, we remain cultural. Until next time, Lord willing.
God bless.